In the first week of 1983, the Wall Street Journal published a favorable but cautious article about TSR called Dungeons and Dragons Game Propels Firm to Success, but Growing Pains Lie Ahead. In the estimation of the journal, TSR controlled around half of the entire market for adventure games. They reckon this made up 5% of the total market for non electronic games. TSR boldly promised the journal that sales will continue to almost double in each of the next 2 years. The growing pains came in when the journal interviewed former Dragon editor Jake Jaquette. He had left TSR because, as he put it, the inexperience and nepotism were making it difficult for things to function smoothly. He cited the problems with the Fantasy Forest board, all but naming Jack Sloan. Jaquette told the journal that TSR Hobbies employed 20 relatives of Brian Bloom. Gygax put the number at 10 and denied that the sprawling Bloom family network posed a problem for the company. Given all the Blooms, Sloans, Witt, and Stanos, the number was certainly at least 15. With D&D sales leveling off, revenue would presumably double through diversification. The journal did commend the success of the Endless Quest series, remarking that the 4 books introduced last summer rank first, second, fourth, and fifth on the list of juvenile bestsellers compiled by B. Dalton Bookseller. This article also was one of the first places that TSR publicly telegraphed the extent of its media ambitions. In addition to the radio show pilot and planned film, TSR may produce cartoons for Saturday morning television. To cast such a wide net, they needed people, and Gygax predicted TSR would recruit up to 150 more in the next year or so. All this did begin to sound rather expensive, the journal noted. TSR plans to continue its rapid expansion, and to do that may borrow substantial sums for the first time. TSR signaled its move into new markets at the start of the year with a revised corporate logo, one that no longer depicted wizards or lizards, but instead just the stylized outline of the letters TSR in a diagonal descent that only hinted at a dungeon map's geometry. On the back of the annual dealer catalog, Kevin Bloom, in his capacity as president of the TSR Service Group, announced that the company had chosen as its motto for the year, New Directions for a Proven Leader. He stressed diversification measures like the craft products of Greenfield Needlewoman, concluding, "Let us together make 1983 a banner year for games, toys, hobbies, and crafts." Although 1983 would be a banner year for games, it would not be in the way TSR had hoped. The entire industry was upended by a single new title, an import from Canada that traded at an obscene price point of up to $40. Released domestically in March 1983, Trivial Pursuit would soon flood the American retail game marketplace, invading the shelf space in Kmart's and bookstores where D&D might otherwise have connected with customers, bringing in some $70 million by the year's end. Its meteoric rise made TSR's year-over-year growth for the past decade seem plodding. There was no small irony that Trivial Pursuit contained a sports and leisure category. Question: who invented Dungeons and Dragons? The answer inevitably listed only one name: Gary Gygax. As they planned to enter the toy market aggressively, TSR had to hit all of the early trade shows of 1983, where hobby stores made purchasing decisions and spent lavishly to stand out from the crowd. TSR shipped 26 employees to the HIA show in Anaheim at the end of January, some of whom stayed for 12 days for the construction and dismantling of their 40 by 80-foot castle booth. Not content with keeping their assault limited to the realm of business, Mayfair Games famously erected a small wooden catapult with accompanying styrofoam rocks so they could bombard the walls of TSR's castle. No, the insider reported with disappointment, TSR never did sally forth to attack the besiegers. TSR's fortifications protected its ambitions. Within their walls, you might meet Larry Elmore, the cover artist for Mentzer's revised basic rules, who sat in front of a huge reproduction of that iconic image. Gary Gygax and Kevin Bloom posed for pictures holding copies of reskinned Advanced Dungeons & Dragons rulebooks with less demonic art furnished by Jeff Easley. Connie Stano would represent the Greenfield Needlewoman, who'd be exhibiting in a newly designed booth, which will also be a real attention getter, as Random Events promised. Having a strong craft showing was a necessity at the HIA, as the association's convention coordinators placed a heavy emphasis on crafts. Of the more than 600 exhibitors spread out over 1,300 booths at the HIA show, only about 50 were from companies in the adventure gaming category. The hobbies and crafts industry, which accommodated effectively all leisure products sold by hobby retailers, from model airplanes to yarn to computer games, represented a 3.5 billion market at the time. At about 1% of that total, adventure gaming remained a slender slice of the pie, and role playing games just a sliver of that. The insider noted that no new TSR role playing games were presented at the HIA event, but its rival, Avalon Hill, announced its soon to be released Powers and Perils, its first fantasy role playing game. Spearheaded by Richard Snyder, given reports that Avalon Hill's analog game sales were down 15% from the previous year, and with the demise of SBI Fresh in everyone's mind, Powers and Perils would be the only one front in Avalon Hill's bid for the role game market. They had also acquired ex-TSR designer Tom Moldvay's Lords of Creation, a project that had gained little traction with his former employer, but now reportedly commanded a $10,000 advance. They even whispered to the insider of a new gangster RPG called Machine Gun Kelly by Dave Arneson. Though different World's gossip would soon clarify the project was mostly designed by Steve Lortz, but I hear Dave Arneson's name is on it to promote sales. All this just built up to the big news. Avalon Hill had secured the rights from the Chaosium to publish a new edition of RuneQuest, one of the most respected competitors to D&D in the fantasy role-playing game space. And then Victory Games, the former SBI design team at Avalon Hill, had aspirations in role-playing as well. If these plans came to fruition, Avalon Hill would be mounting a direct multi-pronged assault on TSR's core business. There was no heritage booth at the HIA show, as about 5 weeks prior, their bank had called in hopeless debts and shuttered the operation. Beforehand, Heritage had been entertaining suitors for a potential acquisition. Since Duke Seafried was still a substantial shareholder, he had no small interest in seeing the company make a graceful landing. Kevin Bloom had flown down to Dallas to discuss a purchase, but no deal resulted. Naturally, after the fiasco with SPI the year before, the exact role TSR played in the demise of Heritage, another of the cornerstones of Gamma, became subject of some dark rumors. Space Gamer had previously reported Bloom and Seyfried had never even spoken to the principals at Heritage during their purported scouting expedition. Kevin Bloom had started to take a more public-facing role at TSR, so at the HIA show, he summoned that reporter John Ranklin to clarify TSR's ambitions in the miniature space. Space Gamer had also covered the imminent expiration of the Grenadier license and the hardball tactics of TSR had employed unsuccessfully to force Grenadier into a lopsided partnership. Rankin would secure a more in-depth follow-up interview with Bloom, who described himself as a cold fish in the business sense, and yet he's as pleasant a fellow as you could ever hope to meet, charming in fact, in a reserved sort of way. Rankin could not resist asking Bloom about the rumors of a potential split of TSR, including one provocative story that Gary Gygax planned to exit the company, possibly with Duke Seyfried in tow, to develop Greyhawk as an intellectual property, and that Kevin and Brian Bloom planned to sell TSR's remaining assets to Mattel. Rankin suggested there were 3 or 4 versions of this floating around the HIA show. Bloom shrugged off those tall tales. When pressed about any schism in the management, Bloom preached unity. Brian and Gary and I run this company as a triad. And obviously we don't have 100% unanimity, but to date we have always been able to find an agreeable position among the 3 of us. We have never had the types of problems one would normally associate with a triad. We counterbalance each other amazingly well. The Wall Street Journal article had mentioned that Gygax concedes that he lacks management expertise, as did his partners, the Blooms, which they hope to address by taking a few management courses. TSR had the year before begun working with the American Management Association, an educational group that supported corporations with various training programs, seminars, and accreditations. At the beginning of the year, TSR began offering AMA courses like Essentials of Management to employees. Apparently, some 60 staffers participated in that course at a cost to the company of around $20,000. The Human Resources Organization made it clear in the February random events that these programs are actual, measurable indicators of the company's interest in promoting organizational development. Gygax and his co-president Blooms would travel to attend the AMA's management course for presidents, and all vice presidents would take the top management briefing, an in-house equivalent. But the most glaring deficiencies in their management could not be repaired with incidental training courses. TSR engaged a firm headed by the industrial psychologist Robert Thompson to provide guidance on improving performance at the senior executive level. Thompson recommended that Judy Witt, Kevin Bloom's sister-in-law and then executive vice president of Business Information Services, should obtain a bachelor's degree at the least. The company therefore agreed she would take a sabbatical and enter Lake Forest as a student in the fall semester. TSR would cover her tuition fees and any other expenses, providing her, as well, an annual stipend. The reality that TSR would soon be paying a direct relative of the Bloom family not to work at the company could only redouble concerns about nepotism. Still, these expenditures would not make or break a company of TSR's size. Investments in mainstream media advertisements had now reached a point where they dwarf this sort of petty cash. The $1 million worth of consumer print ads they projected for 1983 paled beside the $2.1 million they would spend on television, with a further $500,000 earmarked for radio spots. Comparatively, they budgeted only $200,000 for industry and trade press. They wanted to reach consumers, not retailers. Almost exclusively, these ads promoted two titles, D&D and Star Frontiers. While there was some grousing internally about promoting Star Frontiers, the forthcoming May 1983 conclusion of the Star Wars trilogy, Return of the Jedi, made a space opera role-playing game look like a sensible bet. Visiting the Games Fair convention in the UK in March, Gygax had much to say about the movie business, including how he hoped to be an advisor on the forthcoming 1984 Conan sequel, as TSR was now in negotiations to license the Conan property for modules and possibly endless quest books. He waxed rhapsodically about the screenplay for the D&D movie, reiterating his frequent promise that it would be fall between Star Wars and E.T. By the end of April, media observers had already begun signaling that Marvel Comics was working on an animated series based on D&D. With this would come an agreement between TSR and Marvel to license the characters and properties of the animated series for coloring books and related children's products, and the possibility of a Marvel-themed superhero game if TSR could persuade Marvel to partner with them, rather than the well-funded Mayfair. In pursuit of these media interests, Gygax spent a good amount of time in Hollywood, as he wrote in Dragon late in the spring, announcing what was then called the Dungeons & Dragons Children's Show. He promised the promised Saturday morning cartoon, not that it was all business. Gygax also sat in the fabled Polo Lounge and quaffed foaming jacks of scotch and soda or beakers of silver bullets. But that was all part of networking in California, to build contacts for television and film properties, including making the acquaintance of the worthy Buck Rogers man, Fint Dill. Dill was a young writer who was already working on Saturday morning cartoons like the Mr. T series and would soon have credits for G.I. Joe and the Transformers, who also happened to be the grandson of the original publisher of Buck Rogers. Gygax and Dill had begun collaborating toward a sword and sorcery television series. With a bit of luck, Gygax added wistfully, "I'll be returning to sunny California soon to turn outlines into scripts and scripts into film." A February notice in the Lake Geneva Regional News forecasted that this month, TSR will complete construction of its $3,500,000 addition to the company's international corporate headquarters on Sheridan Springs Road. They needed the space given the pace of hiring. The year before, each issue of Random Events might introduce 8 or 12 new hires, with headshots and a paragraph of text. Now the March 1983 Random Events alone fit 25 headshots onto a single page, and then an additional 24 on another page, the latest of 312 total TSR Hobbies employees, with perhaps another 25 or so attached to the TSR UK subsidiary. Hiring was simply out of control. Between staffing facilities, advertising, and diversification, the company was spending a staggering amount of money. In the spring, TSR's Human Resources Department ran a service called Direct Line, permitting staffers to submit anonymous questions to senior management through a Dropbox. Employees were well aware that TSR was going into debt. One bold soul asked, if TSR needs money, why borrow it from banks instead of allowing investors to buy shares? Many employees would have gladly purchased equity in the company. The closest they could get was investing in the TSR profit-sharing plan. The response was, TSR is not, in general, currently making its stock available for sale. One of the main reasons for this is that we have had a number of incidents which ended in a person who is unfriendly toward the company controlling some of our stock. Now that did not just hint at the likes of Arneson and McGarry, but Niebling as well, echoing sentiments that Gygax had expressed as far back as 1975. The Direct Line response went on to declare, selling to outsiders would cause us to eventually give up control over our own destiny. TSR could have managed its debt if sales had followed the curve projected the year before, and indeed, in the early April, Gygax told the press that he's approached almost daily by corporate suitors to go public with a stock issue or to sell out to a conglomerate, boasting that the company's rather cautious sales projection for 1983 is 35 million, a far cry for the 75 million he had predicted the year before, but this too would turn out to be naively optimistic. TSR had been in the business long enough to know that the first quarter of a calendar year would be slow following the holidays, and the company often took a loss for those months. But when a rebound failed to manifest by April and then into May, the senior executive team realized that sales were drastically below the worst case estimates, nothing like the doubling they had promised Wall Street Journal just a few months earlier. The issue of Random Events released in mid June would turn out to be the last. Its front page displayed two stories, each with a picture of its author. One called by Gygax called Innovation, Where We Came From, Where We Are Going, and the other by Brian Bloom titled TSR Means Innovation. Both of them tell the origin story of the company with ample deference to one another, though Gygax focused more on where they came from than where they were going. Bloom wrote optimistically of the future Greensfield Needlewoman product line and boasted for years, bankers have been amazed that we could grow to our current size without borrowing their money. All it required was a little innovative financing. And looking back to the close of, say, the 1981 fiscal year, it was remarkable. TSR held no banknotes and perhaps had 230,000 in long-term debt, most of which only 64,000 would come due by 1982. But as the 1983 fiscal year closed in June, TSR's debt situation had changed dramatically. The company had borrowed roughly $4 million from banks at this point and owed a further $2 million in accounts payable to vendors and service companies. At this point, the company was borrowing against its line of credit with the American National Bank just to make payroll. The bank was alarmed by this situation and had considerable influence it could exert over the company, which it was now beginning to exercise. A look at the fundamentals for the 1983 fiscal year explains why an intervention was necessary. Where sales were strongest, they were flat. The TSR revenue nominally grew this year up to 26.7 million, a modest improvement on the 22 million they booked the year before, but a big chunk of that income, 4.3 million, is attributable to the growing publishing business. That is Rose Estes and Les Quest novels, which had by the middle of the year sold around 2 million copies, albeit it not augur well that Estes, still furious over the rejection of her stock exercise, quit the company around this time after an unsuccessful attempt to negotiate better compensation for her efforts. TSR's licenses for third-party products brought in a further 1.8 million. Andy Levinson, TSR's New York-based licensing director, had secured a dozen new licenses over the past year, but considering only revenue from games, 1983 figures were basically flat over the year before, and this would be the first year that TSR had to book significant interest payments on the money that they were borrowing, more than 600,000. They scraped up cash wherever they could, including with the sale of the little gray house at 723 William Street, their first office, and the original home of the Dungeon Hobby Shop. It was moreover obvious by this point that Greenfield Needlewoman had no prospect of growing into a fifth of the total income of TSR Hobbies now or ever, and that the business should simply be discontinued. TSR would write off $504,702 for shuttering it as they closed out the 1983 fiscal year. As a result, the company took a narrow loss, audited at $69,410. Long before they announced these figures, the triumvirate at the top of TSR knew well that meaningful changes had to be made. When a formerly profitable company takes a loss, an executive reshuffle will often follow. What TSR Hobbies needed was an organizational structure that would isolate the steady games business from riskier diversification measures like the craft needlework business or their substantial gamble on media properties. Moreover, if they're going to make a serious entry into international markets, they could minimize the tax consequences by keeping money from international sales offshore. There was talk of millions connected to the toy business tied up in Hong Kong. But perhaps most of all, TSR needed to curtail areas of overexpansion. So the directors did what gamers call splitting the party. They divided the company in four. A note to the division heads went out on June 13th announcing that the board of directors intended to change the name of the company from TSR Hobbies Inc. to simply TSR Incorporated. With that, TSR Hobbies would cease to exist 8 years after its founding, and with it went the position of president of TSR Hobbies, formerly occupied by Gygax, now unoccupiable. Gygax would lead all film and television products under a TSR media company. The lucrative licensing business would go to Brian Bloom, who would manage Andy Levison and his team as TSR Ventures. All international business, including the TSR UK subsidiary, would be organized under a new TSR Worldwide umbrella run by Andre Mullen. Everything that remained, the original business in games, publishing, miniatures, and so on, would follow TSR Incorporated. That company would be headed by Kevin Bloom, rather than being organized under an ever-growing set of unwieldy divisions. Now there would be only 6 clean divisions reporting to Kevin, where Brian Bloom had been the chairman of the board of TSR Hobbies Incorporated. Now Gygax would be chairman of the board at TSR Incorporated. This eliminated the problem of having 3 presidents for one company. Gygax could run his own company, Brian Bloom another, and Kevin Bloom yet another. But with the presidents of all 4 companies reporting to a board of directors composed of those 3, the situation seemed likely to reignite the same disputes that arose in the TSR Hobbies triumvirate. Or maybe it would work better, and it was worth trying. There was just one more process they had to execute, which the bank demanded: immediate staff reductions to offset the reckless hiring over the past 12 months, which had grown total payroll to nearly 400. The plan went to effect on the morning of Friday, June 24th. The chosen leaders of the consolidated 6 divisions of TSR were summoned to a 10:30 meeting that described the new structure. Others who would be moved under those 6 vice presidents, including Ernie Gygax, were similarly debriefed then. By 11 o'clock, the bulk of the leadership team was sequestered at the Shore Club, in a hotel a few miles south from downtown Lake Geneva, on the other side of Buttons Bay. Over the next several hours, the staff reductions were executed at Sheridan Springs, with nearly 60 persons removed from the payroll. Some of the layoffs reflected the elimination or consolidation of positions, while others targeted underperforming employees. Everyone received a week or two of severance, and many were eligible for placement services, as well as extensions on health insurance and similar benefits. Dick Gleason, the head of human resources, remained at headquarters to handle any disgruntled employees, and reportedly tensions ran high enough that Gleason's life was threatened. June 24th was a day of reckoning for many key players at TSR, and a culling of unsuccessful or risky ventures. It was unsurprising to see the managers of Greenfield Needlewoman leave the company after TSR wrote off the acquisition. It was also the last day many other relations of the Blooms, including Bob Sloan and his controversial son Jack, Steve Witt, had received his last paycheck earlier in June, and Judy Witt would simply enter her sabbatical at Lake Forest under an increasingly dubious arrangement that would later dissolve into fresh scandal. Duke Seafried, head of special projects for Gygax, left the company, and with him much of TSR's hope for dominating the miniatures and toy business. A few major initiatives were shuttered in the process. TSR walked away from mass market board games like Fantasy Forest, which were expensive to produce yet returned low sales. They also pulled the plug on their computer games business after their brief foray the year before, leaving this entirely to partners like Mattel and, of course, to competitors ranging from Avalon Hill to newcomers like Electronic Arts. A group that had already recruited designers the likes of John Freeman and former TSR staffer Paul Reich. Both Gygax and the Blooms did protect their immediate family from the purge. Doug Bloom would now report directly to Brian Bloom at TSR Ventures, and Ernie Gygax would remain in consumer services through the summer to oversee the conventions before relocating to his father's media business. Despite his ostensible withdrawal from game design, Gary Gygax, moreover, retained Frank Mentzer and Francois Mosella Freudeville as direct reports, working on special products, including Mentzer's ongoing revisions to the basic Dungeons and Dragons game. Mentzer became creative aide to the chairman of the board. In external publicity, TSR put a brave face on the changes. The wily Dieter Sturm would not confirm any link between the reorganization and financial setbacks, insisting more or less what you're looking at is money coming into the company from sales and not focused properly. But every last detail of TSR's difficulties was consumed ecstatically by the hobby zines of the day. The best contemporary coverage came from The Insider, though it must have noted that June 23rd had marked the final closure of Heritage when their last assets were auctioned off, so Barash probably found TSR's comparatively minor problems a welcome distraction from his own sad situation. In Barash's estimation, in the power struggle over TSR, Gygax had deserted the battlefield to others, retreating to California to become a movie writer, producer, star, or whatever, to work out some type of deal or deals concerning a D&D movie or series. He judged, not unfairly, that Gygax had pretty much separated himself from the TSR daily operation and found greater personal satisfaction in other pursuits, also in the name of D&D. So Barash reasoned. The Blooms offered a position of prestige as chairman of the board and a company of his own that appealed to his current interests. Gygax could hardly refuse. As Barash counts himself not one to indulge in street gossip, he somewhat delicately skimmed over how it had been mentioned by several people that Mr. Gygax had found other female companionship, which eventually led to the breakup of his marriage. It is true that Gygax had separated from his wife Mary in March, just a few months before this corporate reorganization took effect. Barash thus deduced the emotional trauma stemming from a separation and divorce, plus the intense interest in working with mass entertainment, had set the stage for Gary's receptiveness to a major change. It surely also reflects a culmination of ambivalence that Gygax had expressed since the summer of 1980 in places like his Who Am I? Essay about serving as the company's chief executive. Changes in his personal life perhaps made it easier to plot a change in his career. Gossip about Gygax's divorce spread quickly among industry insiders, to no small degree propelled by how inflammatory Gygax's past jeremiads had been. In the course of Gygax's pointless flame war the previous year with Rick Loomis, Loomis had at one point mused that due his own commitment to quality products, I guess I'll never have a mansion on a 5-acre estate, or 29 Arabian horses, or a chauffeured limousine. This apparently prompted Gygax to send a rash personal letter to Loomis in response, with a postscript bragging, "Estate is 23 acres, herd numbers 30 head, but is kept on farm, not estate for the most part." So now, in mid 1983, Loomis could poisonously mention in his new letter, "It is unfortunate indeed that the current gossip is that Gary is flitting with his wife and moving to the West Coast with his girlfriend. I was told the wife was going to keep the estate." So much bad blood had been spilled in the industry that few insiders felt sorry for Gygax. Fortunately, most fans of D&D who read Little But Dragon by way of industry news were effectively isolated from these restructurings and scandals. The process of decoupling the licensing, media, and international businesses from the parent company, TSR Incorporated, would not be a trivial one. The day before the split was announced, Gygax wrote to Kevin and Brian to recommend that his new company operate in Hollywood under the name Dungeons and Dragon Entertainment, a division of TSR Incorporated. He felt that having Dungeons and Dragons in the name was absolutely required in order to sell to the media market. Although there was considerable pressure to separate this new entity from the parent company, within a week Gygax had to concede it does not seem feasible to establish the new corporation as an effective entity prior to August 1st. In part, this was because they lacked any plan to transition the many employees he would poach. The Dungeons and Dragons Entertainment Corporation needed Gygax's son Ernie, TSR's media head John Beebe, his old friend Dave Dimery, long-standing presidential aide Jim Johnson, and a number of other members of support staff. Moving them off the TSR payroll onto checks cut by a newly founded DDEC would take time. The TSR Hobbies Games division weathered the transformation into TSR Incorporated without any significant staff reductions. John Ricketts continued at its helm, and indeed on June 24th had invited the other division heads to his place for drinks when their vigil at the Shore Club became too tense. The Monday after, first thing in the morning, Ricketts held an all-hands meeting that opened with a round of applause from the team. "Thank you for giving me the clap," Ricketts deadpanned. From there, he mostly tried to bolster the group's confidence in the company's continuing viability. As Kevin Bloom now had a more intuitive structure reporting to him and no further distractions resulting from the three presidents arrangements, he would have more time to focus on his executive responsibilities. Ricketts felt that Bloom was already delegating more and giving the division heads the power to make meaningful decisions. One caveat Ricketts had to make was that Gygax and Menser would still oversee the D&D product line, so perhaps some demarcations would not be so stark. Nonetheless, Ricketts expressed confidence that TSR would make $40 million in sales over the next fiscal year, but Ricketts would not remain at the company long enough to see that prediction falsified. A second round of layoffs would come in July, and Ricketts would be out. The bank had insisted on a 30% staff reduction, and the June layoffs had only been the first installment. The second round cut staff down to just shy of 260 souls. Now Mike Cook, publisher of Dragon, would assume the position of Vice President of R&D Products, a division that would encompass toys, hobbies, games, and periodicals. This reflects, in no small part, the enormous power of Dragon as a platform for TSR, one that now reached more than 100,000 subscribers. Among those who exited in the July round of layoffs was Mike Carr. After the Sloan family debacle, Carr had spent the last 9 months in the education department working on books, including his Robbers and Robots, a book in the Endless Quest series that sold 250,000 copies. But we can only feel so bad for Carr. Not only did he manage to sell back his 108 shares to TSR, then valued at $3,000 apiece, but a few weeks later he applied for a job as a commodities broker in Chicago, which turned out to be with the much storied Turtles Group, famous for their radical successes in the early 1980s. The purchase of Mike Carr's 108 shares further bolstered TSR's treasury stock holdings. As of June 30th, auditing records show that TSR owned 400 of its own shares. Since they needed cash quite urgently, it is perhaps unsurprising that in July they sold treasury stock to the TSR profit sharing plan, 120 shares in exchange for $360,000. Removing that much liquidity from the fund, however, made it difficult for long-term employees to claim the benefits they had been promised from it, a source of further disputes with exiting staffers. After Carr's departure, only one member of the original 1976 Twin Cities coalition remained at TSR, Dave Sutherland, the company's first staff artist. Following this reorganization, Sutherland would continue to work in the research and development organization, this time tasked with helping build three-dimensional models for miniature figures. The miniatures business was one diversification effort that TSR continued to push in the summer of 1983. Later, as a cartographer for modules, Sutherland would continue to work at TSR well into the 1990s. With its newfound austerity, TSR would no longer indulge in gestures like the bizarre intervention it had staged for GenCon East the year before. So this summer, the initiative in the combat phase went to its opponents. In 1983, Origins returned to Detroit in July, just weeks before GenCon, replaying the confrontation of 1978. Metro Detroit gamers reported an attendance of 4,500, but disappointed exhibitors grumbled that the count was more like 3,000. Avalon Hill founder Charles S. Roberts resurfaced for Origins in 1983 to celebrate the company's 25th anniversary. One member of the chattering class reported in Alarums and Excursions that Charles Roberts received a plaque naming him the father of board wargaming, and that Dave Arneson received a plaque naming him the father of role-playing games. Everyone knew that this will undoubtedly cause fury in Lake Geneva as an attack on TSR by Gamma, but by this point a narrative had taken hold in the minds of fans. As I understand the history of D&D, the commenter in Alarms and Excursions explained, Arneson wrote the rules and Gygax published them the first time around, and if this is true, then the award was deserved. While Arneson was perhaps the last person who would champion the simple job of writing rules. Such historical nuance would not have much bearing on the decision made at Origins, as Gygax can hardly expect to receive an award by an organization he declared war against. Roberts, for his part, viewed the title with faint amusement, as he had no thought, let alone premonition, of founding a company, avocation, or industry when he designed Tactics, the first modern board war game, adding, "May I note that I would rather be known for something that was the result of deliberate effort." But for Arneson, these sort of ceremonial appearances now defined his role in the community. His name was a battle standard around which those wronged by TSR could rally. When Grenadier lost the D&D license, they immediately secured Arneson's endorsement for their new Fantasy Lords series of generic miniatures. While he still managed his modest adventure games business, manning its booth at Origins to showcase Dave McGarry's new Pentantastar game, Arneson produced effectively nothing for adventure games himself. Instead, he would be found working on a few pages for an anthology project similar to the Chaosium Thieves World that Rick Loomis planned for his City Blade series. No doubt Loomis was delighted to throw a bit of business to the true father of role-playing games. As for Arneson's Machine Gun Kelly project with Steve Lortz, no mention would be made of it again. The combatants who attended the summer conventions in 1983 perhaps suffered from a bit of battle fatigue. Conspicuously absent at Origins was Avalon Hill's promised foray into role-playing games. They had heavily promoted Powers and Perils at earlier trade shows, but one Origins attendee reported people would walk by an empty room where a PMP demonstration was scheduled, peer in, and walk away. When Eric Dott and Tim Shaw of Avalon Hill gamely posed for a picture with the Chaosium crowd to commemorate their RuneQuest acquisition, they still held up the Chaosium edition of the game, as their new edition was still pending. The former SPI staffers at Victory Games under the Avalon Hill umbrella brought their new role-playing game, James Bond 007, to demonstrate, only promising a September release. This would compete directly with the TSR game Top Secret, with the benefit of the popular film franchise license that TSR had sought in 1980 but had been unable to secure. TSR made no official showing at Origins, but they did launch a clandestine mission suitable for an espionage game. Many had read Kevin Bloom's favorable remarks about Gamma in the Space Gamer article earlier this year, and learned that Kevin was at Origins Sunday to discuss healing the rift between TSR and Gamma. But whispers at Origins about TSR's staff reductions and reorganization just weeks before had spawned conspiracy theories that were, as the chattering class put it, bordering on paranoia. A gossiper explained how one Gamma member told me he suspects that the TSR reorganization has as one of its motivations to create smokescreens under which old offenses can be concealed as the Blooms take over Gamma from within, now that the attack from the outside has failed. It was no doubt easier for Kevin Bloom to repair TSR's relationship with Origins while Gygax ramped up his company on the West Coast, headquartered at a Hollywood Hills ranch that was once owned by the movie producer King Vidor. It served as both a home and an office, and immediately became known as Dragonlance West. It had living space enough for Gygax and his son Ernie, as well as a guest bedroom for John Beebe and another for Jim Johnson, and even quarters for entertaining the occasional traveling dignitary. The best part of this arrangement was that the rent on the property could be treated as a business expense. At a time when TSR was culling its employees, The projected annual rent on Dragonlance West came to $120,000. Within the bubble of Hollywood, the extravagance of TSR's past lived on and even intensified. Some of the most beautiful women I've ever seen were around Flint, Dale would recall, and for Gygax it was a time for him to enjoy the profits of his enterprise, filling the mansion with gaming tables and staging lavish parties. We were like a bunch of multimillionaire 12-year-olds. By July, they also had on staff at DDAC Donna Yukovich, who worked as a project coordinator for the office, but it was no secret that she was more than just an employee to Gygax. Even Hollywood could not keep Gygax away from GenCon. He returned to personally address the Strategist Club banquet, apologizing for his absence in California. The insider could not resist a snarky aside. Who was that crazy fellow in the front table at the Strategist Club banquet at GenCon? I understand he cracked up, spewing feud everywhere when Gary Gygax told the audience that he has been out of sight for a while in California doing other things. Sometimes it could be embarrassing to be too much of an insider. In 1983, GenCon began to pull decisively ahead of Origins, with a turnstile attendance reported at over 8,000, probably at least twice the number that gathered in Detroit. It had begun to outgrow the campus facilities at Parkside and now had to branch out into satellite venues. Gygax ran a Sunday seminar on adventure entertainment about the forthcoming mass media depictions of D&D. This year, GenCon brought something sorely missed the year before, a new advanced Dungeons & Dragons hardcover in the form of the Monster Manual 2, which included the many monsters Gygax had socialized in his Dragon column over the past year. It was now featured alongside the basic and expert rules edited by Frank Mentzer and the new white metal fantasy miniature box sets, the final legacy of Duke Siegfried's brief tenure at the company. Right after GenCon, Gygax had to dart to California to manage the launch of DDEC's Great Hope, the Dungeons & Dragons animated series. On September 17th, the D&D Saturday morning cartoon debuted on CBS, and another event timed to coincide with it forced Gygax to hairpin back to Wisconsin. That evening, there was a grand company party in Lake Geneva in lieu of the traditional Founders' Day celebration marking the formation of TSR Hobbies, a company that no longer existed. This year, they commemorated the 10-year anniversary of the establishment of the original Tactical Studies Rules Partnership. Gary Gygax and Brian Bloom co-hosted the event, a more formal affair held at the Americana Lake Geneva Resort, the property that was formerly the Playboy Resort, and thus the venue for the 10th GenCon back in 1977. The pair of them had taken drastic measures this summer to stabilize the company, to which they had dedicated a decade of their lives. Would they succeed? For all their talk about dividing TSR, the plan proved hard to implement in practice. DDEC had to maintain offices in the Sheridan Springs headquarters in Lake Geneva, while Beebe was projected to spend 75% of his time in Beverly Hills. Dimery was only expected to spend 25% of his time there. Donna Yukovich was the project coordinator at Dragonlance West, but Joy McCoskey remained in Lake Geneva to coordinate matters there. During this transitional phase, DDEC staff who needed frequent access to TSR's payroll or procurement services simply had to work at the Torrent building. Like Gail Carpenter, a recent hire who was appointed accounting manager for DDEC in the last week of September. The thin walls between the companies made separating them a tricky proposition. Due to the difficulties of disentangling DDEC from TSR Incorporated, Marvel was sending its royalty checks to the parent corporation, further confusing the supposed split between the two. Over at TSR Ventures in New York, Andy Levinson persuaded LGN to sell figures based on characters like Uni and Tiamat from the animated series, but would that count as revenue for TSR Ventures or DDEC? If they were to split the proceeds, what would be fair shares? Measuring the impact of the cartoon show on the bottom line of the games business also had its challenges. A memo at the time by Demery suggested that a production such as the Saturday morning cartoon children's show is in effect a 30-minute commercial for D&D. Would it not then be natural that some percentage of compensation should be given to DDEC for sales increases, which are obviously due to the exposure of the children's show? And moreover, as TSR's design department began working on a board game based on the children's show, how should the revenue from its sales be shared? Even at the end of October, the most optimistic projections suggested that DDEC would not be able to pay salaries out of its own bank account until the new year, so it effectively operated as a Hollywood branch of TSR Incorporated. The D&D animated series came in with decent ratings. It had a 26-share Nielsen rating for its first weekend for an overall 9 out of the 36 Saturday morning cartoon shows, and then a 24-share, dropping to a rank of 10 for its second weekend. In both cases, it nudged ahead of Pac-Man on ABC, but fell behind the Smurfs on NBC, which was then aired in a domineering 90-minute 3-episode block. Although pleased with the reception of the show, DDEC staffers fretted over the cursory advertising CBS had done for it. DDEC had no budget to advertise independently. The show also faced some production problems. The insider spread rumors that some of the adventures had excessive violence and needed to be yanked. CBS insisted that Marvel had failed to produce the episode. Marvel retorted that CBS held fresh episodes in reserves to make sure they would not have to air a rerun for the November sweeps. Instead, CBS aired reruns for 2 weekends in October, to everyone's disappointment. After all of Gygax's enthusiasm for the Goldman feature film script the year before, there seemed to be little energy at DDEC to pursue it as an opportunity. Instead, there was talk about doing a series of low-budget, swashbuckling, sword and sorcery type movies set in the world of Greyhawk. The film project with the most momentum was a treatment written by Gary Gygax and Frank Dill to be called The Scepter of Seven Souls. Another proposal you can find listed on their project sheets at the time was called Gord the Rogue. But these projects competed for attention with a variety of other computer, radio, and television projects. Ernie Gygax spent some time developing whimsical, animated cartoon proposals for ideas like Smallest Samurai and the Cyber Commando Champions. Sometimes it felt like the disparate ideas around media properties and games just might snap into alignment. Looking only at the numbers, the acquisition of Amazing Stories the year before had failed to deliver much of a return. Despite the makeover by TSR's art department and a superior distribution network, the venerable progenitor of science fiction magazines continued to drop in circulation. But near the end of 1983, TSR was contacted by Universal Studios, who wanted to license Amazing Stories for a potential television program. It turned out that behind Universal was Steven Spielberg, who intended to use the brand as a vehicle for a new anthology series. Not that TSR knew this at the time they agreed to license the title. Such a high-profile media property necessarily created opportunities for TSR and DDC alike, but to realize these opportunities, the companies needed an interface that worked. The lavish lifestyle and grand ideas in Beverly Hills were on a collision course with sobering reality of declining revenue at the home office. Near the end of the year, with no financial relief in sight, TSR's bank insisted on more significant restructuring. In addition to further staff reductions, TSR relied heavily on its business consultant Robert Thompson to oversee this reorganization. Thompson recruited a new Vice President of Finance and Corporate Secretary, Wilbur J. Scott, an executive who formerly held senior positions at Stallwright, a Wisconsin manufacturer. Scott began introducing a bit of fiscal discipline on all parts of the operation. Furthermore, Thompson identified 3 local executives to serve on the board as outsider directors to show the bank that TSR was committed to accepting more seasoned guidance from the very top. The outside directors were Wesley Summer, president of the E.F. Brewer Company, a medical equipment firm, James Huber, a partner at Foley and Lardner, the law firm that represented Gygax in his divorce proceedings, and Robert Kidden, the human resources vice president at Rexnord, another manufacturing firm. Thompson held meetings at his office to introduce them to Kevin Bloom, and at the November shareholder meeting they were dutifully voted to the board. All had a safe reputation for traditional expertise in managing companies. Through spokesman Dieter Sturm, TSR now issued platitude corporate press releases marking these sorts of changes. Kevin was quoted as saying, "The addition of the new members is intended to strengthen the company by injecting into its control and planning systems the expertise and demonstrated accomplishments of these directors." That same shareholder meeting incidentally held the value of TSR stock steady at $3,000. It is a fitting bookend to 1983 that, in the final weeks of the year, the Wall Street Journal wrote a follow-up piece to its January article about TSR titled, "After Success of Dungeons & Dragons, TSR Fights Poor Management, Uneven Growth." The grinning portrait of Gary Gygax below the hairline draws the eye to that poor management quip. The article reviews the various layoffs, the eccentric new ventures that never panned out, and of course, the write-off of one company, Greenfield Needlewoman, that gave TSR a loss. Under Kevin Bloom's administration, the Journal was pleased to see more experienced and traditional managers were entering the company, including Wilbur Scott and the 3 new outside directors. But of the new managers, the Journal astutely noted, none, however, have experience with the tricky game industry and its fads. Much rested on the success of the Dungeons & Dragons Entertainment Company. Now the company is placing most of its hope for greater sales of the game in the new Dungeons & Dragons cartoon show. Did not escape the attention of the Journal that the show was trailing the Smurfs in its time slot. At the end of the Journal article, Kevin Bloom implied that TSR was an attractive acquisition target, but that surrender was not in the cards. "We're having too much fun, and we make far too much money." For the time being, that money overwhelmingly came from D&D sales, and Gygax still held control over D&D. The design staff cranked out modules, but Gygax jealously guarded the core products in the basic and advanced Dungeons and Dragons lines, carefully shepherding all work toward them. As Menser developed the companion rules throughout the year, Gygax found time to read the drafts, injecting pedantic correction about matters like the range of weapons. Moreover, The pair began collaborating on future D&D products, including the work towards Gygax's long-delayed Temple of Elemental Evil and the new book of Marvelous Magic that would be published with both their bylines. This inspired Gygax to leverage fractions of his 2.5% contractual royalty as an unofficial creative bonuses program. In a note to Menser, he wrote, "I propose you get 80% of the royalties for the D&D game supplemental book of magic items as you conceived and did much of the work." Gygax had long been grooming Frank Menser to take on a revision of Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. In a memo, Gygax invited Menser to notify him when he was ready to begin this immense project, promising, "I will then schedule the creative meetings and direct the outlining of the changes to be made, time schedule, and personnel to be used." That memo went out with carbon copy to Mike Cook, the executive in charge of the games division, as if it were a mere formality to let Cook know how things were going to go. After all, Gygax was chairman of the board of TSR. He had been the steward of Dungeons and Dragons since its publication, to the great success of the company. Who would ignore his guidance? As a member of all the board of directors of the nascent companies, Gygax still worked closely with the Blooms. All three traveled to attend in person the December 1983 board meeting at the Mill, the offices of TSR UK. There was necessarily friction between them, as there had been when the three-president structure was first announced. In theory, giving each of the three their own company would give them a personal area of direct responsibility. In practice, however, the party did not split cleanly, a reality that had stultifying consequences for the business. TSR turn results for 1983. Revenue 26.7 million, losses 69,000. Employees 400, stock valuation 3,000. GenCon attendance versus Origins 8,000 versus 3,000 to 4,000. Nielsen rating of D&D cartoon debut 26 share. Players eliminated. Heritage. Unsure when we'll pick this back up. Should be either Monday or Tuesday night. This will be the penultimate chapter, 1984, Cursed.